Shalom. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery through the book of Deuteronomy.
Good morning, everybody. So exciting to be back in our Deuteronomy class again. And shalom to you, Theophilus. Of course, that's the Greek name meaning lover of God. And we love God. You know, that's the name that Luke used in his gospel to address his audience. So today we are back here looking at the book of Deuteronomy. Again, that's the Greek name that means, some people call it a second law because Deutero means second, and nomos is actually the Greek word for law. But really, it means a copy of the law that is to be made. And you can find a reference to this in Deuteronomy chapter 17. But today we are in chapter 5. And this is a really exciting chapter. We're going to begin right at verse 1. And I'm just going to ask Sengyan to just read us verse 1 itself.
Moses called on Israel and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your hearing today, that you may learn them and be careful to observe them."
Just this verse alone is so packed with things. Moses says, "Shema, Israel." You have heard this before. Shema means to hear or to listen. And there's so much that, can go into what Shema really means. But really, the answer to what it means is found in the three verbs found in the end of this, which is really lamat, shomer, and asad. Okay, in Hebrew it says, "Lamattem otam shomartem asotem." What this really means is you are to learn them, and you are to observe or to keep them. And the word shomer is to basically to watch over them and to do them. These three things, four things really: to shema, to hear; to to lamat, to learn it; and to observe it or to keep it; and also to do them. This is going to be the recurring theme throughout all the law. Okay, so today we're going to look at the rest of this whole chapter, really listing out some of the really important laws, what we come to know as the Ten Commandments. I'm going to continue a little bit. I'm going to jump to verse 3 real quick here. It says, "The Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with you." Now, what does that mean, What does it mean that I thought that the Lord made this covenant? Which is what happened in Exodus chapter 18, 19, and all the way through 24. That is what God basically did. So what does it actually, what do you think it means? What does it mean that when it says, God did not make this covenant with your fathers? That is a bit puzzling. I'm guessing that it probably means that this covenant, referring to the one that they're making, in other words, God is making a fresh covenant with the people who are there today, right? This is different from your father's covenant is your father's covenant. And I think that's maybe a good thing for us to keep in mind. God makes his covenant afresh with all of us, Someone used to tell me that God has no grandchildren, or something to that effect. You heard that term, right? God has no grandchildren. And you don't just become a Christian because you're born into a Christian family or you're born into a Jewish family, and then automatically you have to make your covenant anew with people. Okay, so that's verse 3. God did not make this covenant with fathers, but with us and those who are here today, all of us who are alive. And verse 5, it says, "I stood between," and this is Moses saying, "I stood between the Lord and you at that time to declare to you," and Moses was playing the role of an intermediary, right? Sort of like a mediator, "to declare to you the word of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire, you did not go up to the mountain." And we read this in Exodus chapter 20, verses 18 to 21. The people said, "Moses, you go and talk to God, because if we go and we hear God, we will die." They actually probably won't die. But then came after that the whole recounting of the 10 things, what we call the Aseret Devarim, the 10 words or the 10 things, which in English sometimes we call it the 10 Commandments. You can find a parallel of this in Exodus chapter 20. So some of you may want to be looking at this on the one hand, and Exodus chapter 20 on the other hand, because you can see if there are any differences. Now, the versification, many people don't realize this, but the versification, the verses that you have here, may not always be the same. Because in this section, there are, when you look at the Hebrew Masoretic text, what you discover is really there are well, there are the words itself, the consonants. Then there are the dots that make up the vowels. Okay, there are dots that make up the vowels. And the original Hebrew didn't have the vowels; they just had the consonants, right? And later on, people inserted the vowels to help people remember. They probably knew how to pronounce the words, but they didn't write it down. And then you have the accent marks. These are things like, which words are to be connected together, and so on and so forth, the different side. And then, of course, you have the notes on the side. Now, the accent marks are kind of different. There are two sets of accent marks going on here, and which is why sometimes people will follow one set of accent marks and you get one set of verses and another one. Further to this, you also find that maybe the Catholics have a different way of counting which is your first commandment, so on and so forth, right? So let's look at the commandments itself. The first commandment, verse 6. I am the Lord. Okay, really interesting. I am the Lord your God. Here you have to learn a little bit of Hebrew, because in Hebrew, the personal pronoun is often ani. So everyone say ani. Yeah, ani means me, right? I. But here you have another Hebrew pronoun, anochi. So what's the difference between anochi and ani? Well, some scholars say anochi is an emphatic. You say, I and only I, right? As opposed to me. Me is kind of generic personal pronoun. So God is saying anochi, and really he uses this several times here as well as in Exodus chapter 20, right? And God is emphatically saying, Anochi Yehovah, I am Yehovah. Okay, that's just like, okay, let's make this very clear. This is God saying. So he writes this down. You remember, this is what appears on the tablets, right? Remember this? So he says, I'm Yehovah, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And here begins. I have maybe Seng Yen can read for us that commandment. Verse 7.
Verse 7, you shall have no other gods before me. And verse 8, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in heaven in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments.
This is just so interesting, all right? You will not make for yourselves any gods before my face, is what the Hebrew says, in my presence. No gods in my presence. I don't think it means that you can make it behind his presence, because God is everywhere. Do not make for yourselves any idol or any statue or any carved clay, all likeness which is in heaven from above, which is from earth below. In other words, do not make not just statues of what you think God is, but no statues of anything that you might worship. All right. The word there in verse 9 is to bow down. Now, the word bow down is the same word that is often translated as worship. So really in Old Testament, you get this word, ishtachayu. It really means to bow down. And to bow down is to acknowledge the lordship, or to acknowledge the master, that someone is a master, and to say that, okay, I'm going to serve you, right? So the idea of worship in the Old Testament has absolutely nothing to do with singing songs or anything like this. It has to do with who do you acknowledge as the boss, okay? And I'm going to do whatever you say. So you will not make any of these things, which are the sort of things that people in the land would do, right? Everywhere you go, they make all kinds of statues and they worship them. You will not do any of them. You will not serve them, for Jehovah is a jealous God. Wow, what does that mean? Visiting iniquity of the fathers over the children, and over 30, that's the actual Hebrew, over 30, and many, 30 and many, and fourth of those who hate me. Now, this is often translated in such a way that people think, oh, okay, this is a generational curse, right? If your father does something and then the children, I don't think so. I don't think that's actually what it means. But we will discuss this more in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 16. So we'll save it for the exciting discussion that will come later on. We're going to proceed to the second commandment, and verse 11.
Verse 11, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless.
Okay, what do you think this means? How do you actually keep this commandment? Any idea? Anyone here? What does it mean to not take the name of your God in vain? Well, when I was growing up, it meant well, at least I thought it meant that you cannot curse using the word Jesus or God, right? So OMG, oh no, you cannot do that. That's like taking the name of your God in vain. I don't know. Do you have this? I mean, these are the 10 words of God, I mean, these are important things. And I think a lot of people don't really give any thought to what this particular commandment means, right? So, to not take the name of your God in vain has a very specific meaning. It does not mean not to curse. And of course, please don't take this as a license to curse, right? But it does not mean to not use the name of God. And in this case, the name of God will be Jehovah, right? And that's what I call the Shem HaMephoresh, or the exact name of God. Or sometimes in the English, you call it the Tetragrammaton, referring to the 4 letters, Yud, He, Vav, He. So, in this particular case, all right, to not take the name of your God in vain, Jehovah is to, let's see, it means do not swear falsely.
Psalms 24, verse 4. He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to an idol, nor sworn deceitfully.
Okay, there you go. Nor sworn deceitfully, right? Now, what does it mean to swear deceitfully? It means to say that someone goes out say, by God, or I'm just giving an example here, by God, okay, so I'm not going to use a proper name of God because I don't want to be swearing now, right? By God, I'm going to let you all go home early today. I'm not saying that. And then later on, you all go back late. Pastor swore falsely, right? Sworn deceitfully. And this Banaja might say, Pastor said, after the year of Jubilee, we can all rest. He has sworn deceitfully. I did not swear, okay? Okay, so that's actually what it means, to not swear falsely, to not, basically to keep your promise if you are swearing, okay? Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 13, you will actually see a bit more commentary on this. So we will come to this again, right? Now, how do people swear in the name of God? And that would be when they say something like, as Jehovah lives, then something, 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 right? Or if they were worshipping other gods, may the gods do to me if I do not do such and such and such a thing. Okay, that would be a way in which people would swear, right? Now, you remember, Jesus actually said something about this particular commandment in Matthew chapter 5, verse 23. Basically, Jesus is saying, do not swear by anything, by the temple or anything else. Let your yes be a yes and let your no be a no. Now, that's essentially what it really means, right? To honor your words, to keep your promises. Don't swear by the temple. And Matthew 23, verse 16 actually says that. And of course, James also said, let your yes be a yes. So to not swear falsely is just another way of saying to honor your words. Particularly when you have made a particular promise on the name of God. But then Jesus comes along and says, it doesn't matter what name you got, your words should always be good, right? And what happened was people used to say something like this, as the temple stands, I'm going to perform such and such a thing. And then when they didn't do it, it says, well, I didn't swear on the name of God. I only swore on the temple, right? Or I swore on something that's minor. And then you become legalistic about why you didn't keep your promise. Jesus says, look, don't play games with the words. Just let your yes be a yes.
We have one question here. Is there a purposeful difference in the usage of Elohim and Yahweh?
Okay.
Or
actually,
Jehovah?
that's a good question. Jehovah is a proper name. Elohim simply means God, or quite literally gods, right? But it is a plural. Words that tend to end with im is plural. So when they say Elohim or Eloheinu, that usually means plural of gods. And the way the scholars describe this is it's called the majestic plural. God is so big, you have to use the plural. It was like, Daniel is so great, you have to call him pastors instead of pastor. Right? He's like 5 pastors. Okay. So anyway, Elohim is just a more generic God. Now, I have to qualify this because there's a very long etymology of these words. And later on, when we come to the next few verses, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these things. But Yahovah is the proper name of God. In the whole Bible, you hear people saying that, the Bible has 50-something names of God and so on and so forth. No, God only has one name. Yahovah is his name, right? And that name is a contraction of 3 words, which is, Hayahoveh and Yiyeh, which is He who was, who is, and He who will come. So the Yeh is the Yehovah, and Hoveh is Ho, and the Haya is the Va. So, and of course, it goes backwards because you read from right to left, right? I mean, they're kind of reversed in that way. So, Jehovah is the proper name of God. Everything else, Lord of hosts, all these are all just titles. Sometimes they describe the function of God. Jehovah Rapha is my healer, Nissi, and all these are just the titles and the functions, right? In the same way that SP is not my name, right? Actually, SP is Singapore Poly, but that's not my name. That's just a title. I've only got I guess one proper name, right? So Jehovah is the proper name of God. Now, many times you discover in the Bible, it's written as capital Lord. Whenever you see in your English text capitalized Lord, that means that in the original Hebrew text, it's actually the Shem HaMephoresh, the full and I guess the exact name of God. Occasionally, you see God in capital, and that usually means the same thing, right? Now, not always, but we'll come to that.
Is there a significance that Yehovah appears in verse 2 and 3? Because it says, there's one question here that says, why Moses said, the Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers. Which covenant? I think the front part of this question is interesting when paired with the idea of Yehovah as personal name.
Well, I'm not sure because, almost throughout the whole Deuteronomy, very often God is referred to as Yehovah Eloheinu or Yehovah Eloheka, means Yehovah, your God, or Yehovah, our God. So that's pretty much almost all the time. There's a couple of places late on in the Song of Moses where you have other kind of ways that they will refer to God, but mainly, no, I don't think there's any special, at least not what is obvious to me in terms of at least in verse 2 and 3 anyway, right? Doesn't seem to be anything of significance there.
And the last question we have here is in regards to marriage. Does it mean if marriages were made in a vow, and when one, as in a vow to God, obviously, and when one's out of the marriage, then one spouse would have, or both spies?
The fundamental truth here is this: if you make a promise, you have to keep it. It really doesn't matter if you make a promise and you use some formulaic words, right? I did not say exactly. You know how it's just like when we were kids, right? And we have this pinky promise, right? And they say, I didn't use my pinky, I used my forefinger, so it doesn't count. I was tricking you. And it's just like integrity there, right? And I think when we should step back from the legalistic way of thinking, oh, this keeps me. Look, two people come together, you understand each other perfectly well that you are entering into a covenant. And once you enter into a covenant, you are obliged to do it, almost regardless of whether you use some formulas or not. Of course, to swear on Jehovah is to honor God, to really honor God, right? So to add to that, whatever promise you said in the end, I swear on or by God that I will do this, I'll do that. And that is taking an oath. And of course, if you break it, then not only do you dishonor the person whom you made the covenant to, you also dishonor God upon whom you took the oath upon, right? So that is so we actually don't put your hand on the Bible and take an oath, right? Jesus says don't take an oath on all these things, but sometimes we do it as a kind of symbolic thing, and actually we don't think very much about what we do. But Jesus basically keeps it real simple. Let your yes be a yes. And even if you're just making a promise to a child, and you said, I'm going to do this for you, but I didn't really say Jesus, right? No, don't do that, okay? You're just going to ruin the child's day, right? So we should keep that promise. Verse 12, watch over the Sabbath. I'm translating literally from the Hebrew here. Watch over the Sabbath. Well, let's call it, the Sabbath will be a rest, right? Watch over the Sabbath day to keep it holy, for it is commanded to you by Jehovah your God, right? 6 days you shall serve or work or do all your work, and on the seventh day, rest or cease to Jehovah your God. Do not do any work, you and your sons and your daughters and your servants and your female servants and your ox and your. By the way, in Hebrew, they like to use the word and. It's probably the most common word, v or u, right? It appears like lots of times. Actually, if you learn u, you already probably learn 1/5 of Hebrew text already. That word appears a lot. They like to use the word and your ox and your donkey and your animals and your foreigners in your gates for the sake of Lama'an, for the sake of rest or settling down your servants and your female servants as well as you. I mean, that's very clumsy. That's why you have the New King James, that is a lot smoother. You shall not work. Wow, what does that mean? You know, this is a very important commandment. If you didn't realize this already, the Sabbath commandment is really important. It's the third commandment by our counting now, right? And I think Christians generally struggle. We struggle with what this commandment means to us. And do we have to keep it on the Sabbath day? You know, because most of us go to church on Sunday, right? So we sort of do this thing in our mind that changes. Actually, it's kind of funny because in the Anglican Diocesan Service book, they actually have a section where they read out the commandments, the 10 commandments. But when it comes to the third commandment, it's that you shall keep the Lord's Day. So they make a little switch there to make our life a little bit easier, I would think so. Because if they say you shall keep Sabbath day, and then they don't really keep Sabbath day, it's kind of funny, right? So I think we all struggle with this. You know, what does this mean? So let's try and break this down a little bit in our remaining time. What does it mean? What do you think it means to rest? So the word work here, malaka, really is not just any kind of work. Because today, if you go to Israel, you find that Orthodox Jews have all these very onerous commands or what called fence laws to say this is work, that is work, all these things you cannot do, right? You probably have heard of a Sabbath day's walk, right? In some of the New Testament, they use this term. That means on a Sabbath day, you can only walk this amount of distance. Anything more than this distance is work. Less than this distance is not work. So for many people, walking around in your house is not work, right? So the way they do this in Jerusalem is they put a wire all around Jerusalem, say, this whole city is my house, so I can walk anywhere in my city. You know, it's kind of getting around the law. But I think that kind of misses the point, because you're really getting into the nitty-gritties and how can we escape this law. So the work, malaka here, your occupation, right, really includes whatever you do. I guess it is your daily occupation or your trade. Why don't we just look at Matthew chapter 12 for a second here? You know, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields of the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck grain to eat, right? So actually plucking grain, some people will consider this work. And this is probably what got the other guys all riled up. How come you guys are working? But Jesus didn't consider this work, right? Why didn't he consider this work? Because they were fishermen. This was not their work. Fishermen fishing. Now, if I went fishing on a Sabbath day, I would think, for me, this is not work. For me, this is a hobby, right? But if I did my usual occupation on the Sabbath day, that would be considered work. Okay, so I think there's a sense that this is not just any kind of activity or work as defined by physics, right? But I think it really has to do with the sense of what is it that you do in your daily occupation. 1 Samuel chapter 21, David came to Nob, to Ahimelech. Oh yeah, you know what this is, right? This is when they were asking for bread. So David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has ordered me to do on some business. Do not let anyone know about the business which I send you, and all the stuff they were doing secretly. And then he says in verse 3, now therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread and whatever can be found. The priest said to David, there is no common bread, there's only this holy bread. And, you know, he wants to give it to them. And again, Jesus was kind of making a point, you know, this is not, well, the purpose of Sabbath is really for our restoration, which is why you cease from your trade and your work, which actually presents an interesting problem for people like us who are in full-time, all right? We can talk about that a little bit. But Jesus refers to this, and then later on, he makes this argument. Do not even the priests do this, right? Meaning that the priests, even though they are on the Sabbath in the temple, they will still do normal things like wash up. Like, you won't say, I won't bathe while I'm on the Sabbath. Is bathing work? No, I mean, these are all normal things. These are not what you do as a matter of your trade, your occupation. These are part of our restorative activity that we do from day to day. So, Malacca, I think Jesus seems to consider work those things that you do to earn a living, right? That pertain to your trade, your occupation. Beyond that, I think maybe you can call it your restorative activity, right? So, the general idea that you get really comes from Exodus chapter 16. They were out in the wilderness and they started complaining, and God gave them manna, right? And this manna was pretty amazing. You just collect it, but it only lasts one day. So you had to do this every day. It was a daily occupation, right? But then when you get to the day before the Sabbath, that day you can collect twice as much and it will not rot overnight. In other words, by some supernatural arrangement, God will make sure that even though on the Sabbath you do not work, you will have enough, right? That is the meaning. So Sabbath is not simply about working or not working. Yes, I think it's very much about God wanting to give us rest. But in Exodus chapter 16, Sabbath is also a test. Actually, we should read this, right? Exodus chapter 16, verse 29 and 30. Seng Yen, do you have that? Exodus chapter 16, verse 29 and 30.
Verse 29, see, for the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, he gives you on a 6th day bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. Verse 4, then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. And it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily.
So God says, that I may test them, right? So Sabbath is a test. I wonder how we are doing in this particular test. I mean, if you're listening at home or you're going to work today, it is not the Sabbath, but I think as Christians, we need to think a little bit more about this test, which I think many of us are failing, right? Because we see our Sabbath not as sacred. We see it as a kind of like a free time, sort of like, and you can stuff in whatever you need. I have unfinished work. And you feel like, well, I'm just going to take some of my Sabbath. I'm going to do that work. Actually, God is saying, no, you shall not do that work. You will trust me that even you don't do that work on Sabbath, God will help you not lose your job on Monday or something like this, right? Or on Sunday, as it were. So, I think this is really interesting. It's a really interesting commandment. It's something that I think through what it means for me. And for those of you who are on the way to work, you're probably wanting to be thinking, what does it mean for God to say to us that we need to keep Sabbath not only as a rest, but as a sacred, as a holy day? Let's put it aside. Let your Sabbath be a testimony that you trust God, that you don't feel that if I don't do my work, I'm going to be in trouble. No, trust God. Trust God that, the manna will somehow supernaturally be sufficient for the Sabbath. And verse 15 actually says, back to Deuteronomy chapter 5, remember the slaves, right? Remember, you were once slaves in Egypt, and Jehovah your God. So you are to extend this rest to all your men servants, your maid servants, even your animals. Okay, get this. Even your animals, okay? Well, okay, I know some of us got dogs at home, right? So your dogs are to have rest. Okay, the logic of this is that rest is for everybody, right? Everybody needs rest. And you are to remember, because you were once without rest. You were slaves. Now you are no longer slaves. Why do you continue to live as slaves, right?
One is from the perspective of an employer. Can a Christian employer insist on staff working on a 6-day week?
Sorry,
like
what do you
government.
mean that insist on a 6-day week?
So if somebody wants to come in on the 7th day, right?
Oh.
Maybe they don't want to keep
Okay,
the Sabbath.
well, can you? Of course, you can do anything you want, right? You can do anything you want. Should you? I think this is where we need to work out our salvation in fear and trembling. I think that really is something, as Christians, particularly in Singapore, we don't do. We just do whatever we want to do, right? Partly because we don't even know what the Word of God says. But really, you think about this, what is God really saying here? And should you do this? Do you trust God enough that if you don't do the work on Sabbath day, that you can still get by, right? And I think many people say, no, I really need this few hours to finish that contract and do the. I don't know. I think God would not want you to do that, even though you are a Christian and not a Jew. But by the way, when you think about the justification of this principle, other than the fact that in Exodus, well, at least in Deuteronomy, the reason given is because you were once slaves, right? So don't live like slaves anymore. But if you were to go back to Exodus, it gives a completely different justification. I don't know how many of you have looked at that, but Exodus chapter 20:11, the justification is the one that you tend to hear more often, because God rested on the seventh day, right? Actually, if you look elsewhere, you find that there are different kind of ways in which some justify it because of the Exodus 16, some justify it because of Genesis, some justify it because you were once slaves. I think between all these different justifications, it will apply to all of us, right? Particularly the one referring to Genesis. It's not only for Jews, it's for anyone who's in creation. Your dogs, right? Those are not Jews. So, obviously, right? So I think you need to give this a bit more thought. So I know it's not easy. I know we live in a culture that basically does not honor God in this way, right? We are not used to trusting God so radically. But I want to challenge all of us, and that includes myself. We are in church. And how do we spend our Sabbath, right? It does not mean that if you're not to work, you're just like Noah, right? You're supposed to do things that are restorative. And part of that restoration would be to draw near to God, among other things. I think to give yourself to that sort of thing.
Can we take Sabbath not as one day of rest, but as 24 hours or in minutes that can be distributed over the other 6 days?
Like, I have a Sabbath on the 7th minute of every 6 minutes. I don't think so. Again, if you want to do that, more power to you. But that's not what God commands. Okay, I think we have to learn to take God's word at some level of what it actually means. Because otherwise, God's commands becomes like plasticine. You can just like shape it to any way that suits us. It doesn't work like that. You're supposed to shape yourself to suit God's word, right? So I think that might be going a little bit far. Now, of course, there's the whole debate. Is it Saturday or Sunday? Well, to be really honest, I don't. I do like the Sabbath day itself, Saturday. I like that. But again, I guess. Sabbath for Israel is a little bit different from us because we're in a different time zone, right? So I think there's a sense in which you do what is relevant to your local context. I think that's probably true. So I wouldn't have a problem, I think, if someone regularly keeps Sunday as a Sabbath. I think that probably works. But if someone says that, well, I'm the sort of like every 7th hour Sabbath type of person, I don't know. I don't think that really works, okay? Sundown to sundown. These laws are some of the oldest laws that you find. And in fact, one of them you can find is what is known as the Nash Papyrus. Now, when you think about the Hebrew Bible, you do get some scrolls, right? Some scrolls. You have like the Dead Sea Scrolls and others. But before they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest was something known as the Nash Papyrus. And that's actually just a fragment of the law that is also called 4Q phylactery. No, maybe it's not different, not the same. But basically what it was someone wrote this on a little command on this little piece of paper, make it in a phylactery and put it on their hand. And that's how they found some of these really old documents. It's really, really interesting stuff, right? So, and in some of this, sometimes you can find interesting variations. So you probably also want to go back and maybe if you have time, for those of you who are interested in this and you want to study this, you want to look at what Jesus himself says about Sabbath keeping. He does say a couple of things in Matthew chapter 12, verse 8, Mark chapter 2, verse 28, Luke 6, 5, Luke chapter 6, verse 13 to 15. He says that the Son of Man is the Lord of Sabbath, right? You are the Lord of Sabbath. And Sabbath is for rest, for restoration, and not to be taken in a very legalistic manner, right? Wow, we just got through 3 commandments, and we're done with a half an hour. I tell you what, let's do one more, right? Commandment 4. It says, and really, I probably should maybe give a little bit of an overview at this point. Commandment 1 really relates to God and no idolatry, right? And this will come up again, so I didn't speak a lot on that. We didn't talk a lot about because it is a theme that will keep coming up. Commandment 2 relates to everybody, including your neighbors, right? Because, whoever it is that you are going to give your word to, that word must be truthful, right? Commandment 3 relates to all of us too, right? It's kind of like true for everybody. And then Commandments 4 relates to your parents. Commandments 5 to 10 relate to basically your relationship with all your neighbors, right? So actually, only Commandment 1 pertains to something directly relating to God. Of course, everything relates to God, but the more directly Commandment 1, everything else, Sabbath is for us, really, right? I mean, God is already resting. When you think about keeping promises, that is also something that is really for us, for our community, right? So some people say that Commandments 1 to 4 is for God, Commandments 5 to 10 is for us. I don't think so, right? So anyway, we are in the 4th commandment, and super interesting commandment also. It says, give glory, give honor, right, to your father and your mother, for thus commands Jehovah your God, for the sake of your long days, right? I'm just like literally translating it here. And for the sake of things going well, Tov, for you, over the earth which Jehovah your God is giving you, right? So it is something to do with when you enter into this land, you are to honor your parents. And the word honor there is to give glory. And that's a normal way of saying honor, to give respect. So the idea of respecting your elders is not itself contrary to Scripture. I know, we live in a very, I guess, anarchistic sort of like culture. We don't like authorities. We are anti-authoritarian. We don't like people to impose their rank or their seniority on us. But actually, it's not contrary to Scripture, right? And the way is done, okay? It can be controversial, but I think this is something important for us to remember, to respect the older people, to respect the senior people, even to respect, in particular, our parents, to give them honor. Now, you look at Leviticus chapter 19, verse 3, there's a slight expansion on this. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 3 says that every one of you shall revere. Wow, look at that. The word revere, right? So that's to fear almost. Actually, the word revere comes from the word fear. So every one of you shall fear your mother and your father. I kind of feared my mom. She used the cane a lot on me. So that was a fearful thing, right? But we are supposed to be fearful of that. And to keep, that would be keeping our Sabbaths and all that. But really, to revere your parents, right? And when you get to the end of Deuteronomy, you find that there's a special set of curses reserved for people who don't honor their parents, right? Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 16. As a matter of fact, this is one of the commandments that could lead to the death of a rebellious son. And you'll discover that as we go on later, right? 4 commandments, 6 more to go. We hope this has been helpful to you, this discussion, to start your day off thinking about God. And if you have questions, feel free to write in the comments below. Write in something there and give us some feedback about how this is a pre-recorded thing. But we will look up the questions, and if opportunity permits, we may even address some of the questions. So, get your questions in our comments below. God bless you, and shalom.
We hope you enjoyed studying the Word of God. Join us again as we continue through the book of Deuteronomy.